So let's talk a little bit about plot. What is plot? There are traditional definitions of plot, and you've probably heard some of these. They're the series of events that make up your story. It's what happens to your characters. It's the skeleton of your story that you kind of flesh out by adding some description and adding some personality to your characters. I personally don't find these definitions helpful for writing a story. They are helpful if you are dissecting a story in an essay for your high school English class. So it's not that these definitions of plot are incorrect, but they're not super helpful. They're not something that actually helps you put a story together. And of course, if it's not going to help you put a story together, you need to look for another way to plot. My definition of plot is a little different. I believe that plot is a series of decisions that your main character makes and the events that force those decisions. And the reason that I think you need to look at plot as a series of decisions is when you do that, it becomes easy to generate events for your characters that cause them to grow. And because character arcs are such a fundamental part of popular fiction, one of the biggest problems that I see over and over in new writers, or even some experienced writers who are getting traditionally published, is that their character arcs are not driving the story, they're not tied to the external action, and the story feels disjointed or it's emotionally off in some way. And of course, people read fiction to be taken on an emotional journey. So you absolutely want to make sure, if you've got a character arc in there or any sort of character change that you would like to explore through maybe a character dealing with issues, you absolutely want to have that emotional resonance in your story, and you want it to work with the external arc. So this is something that a lot of people don't define. I think the definition of a plot point is incredibly important for understanding how plot works. The traditional definitions of a plot point are that it's a big event in your story, it's something major, it's something that specifically happens to the main character, or it's an emotional high point in the story. And again, these things are all true. They're descriptions of things that are characteristic of a plot point, but these definitions do not help you come up with your plot points. And we want tools that will help us generate these easily. So my definition of a plot point is that it's an event that forces the main characters to make a decision. Every major plot point in your story is going to be a moment of character change. And that's really crucial, because if you start looking at your plot as a series of character changes, it becomes a lot easier to design events that have a lot of emotional impact on your reader. So I'm sure you've seen this plot structure before. Inciting incident, first plot point, first pinch point, midpoint, etc., etc. And maybe you know what each of these points tend to mean, and maybe you don't. Maybe you have used this structure to plot a story and you weren't happy with it. Maybe you've done it successfully, or maybe you tried and you just weren't able to come up with a story using those points. A lot of writers start with a structure and they cannot get to a story. And it's not their fault, because no one has ever explained to them what each of these plot points really means. And I don't mean where it comes in the story and what the name of it is. I mean how it functions in the story, what it actually does for your characters to have those plot points in the story in a particular order at specific intervals in your story. Even worse, often there are a lot of writers out there who have never had it explained to them that if they want to use a particular structure to plot their story, they also have to have a fully developed premise. And the reason for that is that the premise helps you figure out the specific plot points that will make your story work. And if you've seen the premise webinar I did, you know how important it is to have all those elements before you start plotting. And you've seen how many story ideas and plot events fell out of the premises that we came up with. Having that focus and having a clear premise to aim for makes it so much easier to figure out what the events of your story should be. Without a strong premise, you can't come up with specific decision points for your character. And then you end up falling back on cliches, and your plot starts to feel generic, or you can't even finish the plot, you get stuck. And that is the thing that I'm hoping, once you've seen what we're going to talk about tonight, this process, that you are no longer going to be in that position again. You're not going to get stuck. You're not going to end up pulling together a bunch of cliches and things that you've seen from other movies that just feel stale and they don't feel like they're unique, or maybe they don't feel like they fit together. When you have a plot outline and you've completed it and then it just feels very blah, that's often what's happened. So we're going to start with premise. And in fact, I am going to start with one of the premises that we developed in the premise webinar. We're going to use it to come up with questions based on the plot points that generate specific events that give birth organically to subplots, to character arcs, and the kind of emotional resonance that makes a story great.